Hi, good to see you. I just thought that I would follow suit with some of my own favorite authors and share some of my writing. I've just wanted to just share a chapter with you from a book that I published, a novel that I published a few years back called The Weight of Light. And in some ways I can see that there's some timeliness to what the events that occurred in the book somehow in some ways tie in with what's going on here on a deeper level. But so anyway, I just thought I would begin reading. And first, though, I do want to again say how grateful I am for everything that I have in my life, and for all of the amazing people that are out right now working on the front lines of what's going on in our world right now with the pandemic. And hopefully we can all just do our own little thing, our own contribution in some way to help ourselves and those around us to be to feel a little more connected. And one of the ways that humans have done this since time immemorial is with stories and storytelling. So whatever your skills, whatever your talents, whatever your abilities are, if we can find some way to bring them into a place of helping others, I think that's a win. So we will keep it there and in that place of gratitude. So I'll begin. Present day. Zoe sighed and straightened up as she locked the door of her grandmother's house. She turned to face the street. Standing there on that wide, sheltering veranda, rolling the stiffness from her slim shoulders, she felt the weight of every one of her 28 years on the planet. Actually, a great deal more if she was being completely honest. She felt ancient. Today was the day of her grandmother's funeral, and most of her family would already be over at the church. She'd asked them to go ahead while she made some excuse to detour a few streets over just to have a moment alone in the empty house, just to spend a quiet moment in what Zoe considered sacred space. The house would be filled to capacity later with friends and family offering condolences, and would likely continue for several days after. Something was missing, though. Like always, the clutching sensation in her stomach was potent, visceral, not the shredding heartache of her most recent loss, but more like the sharp shock of losing something important she depended upon, took for granted, that had suddenly been whisked away, leaving the panic of a sudden, empty void of nothingness. As if walking down a familiar path in the dark, the ground had just suddenly dropped away from under her next step. And for that one terrible, plummeting, endless moment, questioning if she would ever touch solid ground again. And, like always, Zoe wasn't quite able to put a what or a why to it. Paradoxically, the jolt itself had lately become so familiar that was almost comforting. She wished she could attribute that awful, wrenching feeling to recent events, but by now she knew it wasn't so simple. It had been with her for most of her life, off and on. Plucking a late bloom from the vine that twined up the fluted pillar, she breathed in the fragrance. The same fragrance that had always seemed to follow Nana wherever she was, a buoyant mixture of honeysuckle, lilac, vanilla, and something just sweetly, uniquely her. She remembered lying stretched out on her stomach on the patchwork coverlet in her pajamas, one cheek cradled against the faded, wash-softened cotton, eyes closed, breathing in that same scent, enfolded in a sense of home and security and love, listening while Nana told one of her many wonderful stories. She had spent most of her childhood in this beautiful old Victorian-style house, running through the halls, bounding up the wide staircase, laughing, seeking fearsome gargoyles and dragons among the ornate peeling gingerbread trim in the eaves, snapping beans and shelling peas from the large garden in the overgrown backyard into a bowl, helping to roll and bake fragrant ginger snap cookies in this cozy kitchen where tea was always somehow fresh and hot in the rose-painted, chipped antique teapot. Now it would be hers. The thought was bitter and sweet and painful all at the same time. She could not afford to explore the contemplations now, though, or she risked breaking at a time when she needed her strength the most. Acknowledging the memory with nostalgic reverence, Zoe tucked the small, sweet-smelling pink blossom into the breast pocket of her black suit to sustain her for the rest of the day, slipped the house key back into her bag, and walked down the wide steps and out to the curb where her small car was parked. The massive old trees stretched heavenward, casting the street in dappled shadow, a graceful, arching canopy reminiscent of a shimmering, ancient green cathedral. She paused with her hand on the driver's side handle and then stopped, lips trembling, looking back up to the old house. She pursed her lips into a firm line as tears threatened again. I won't cry. I will not. Ruthlessly, she clamped down on her emotions, turned again to open the car door, and then from the corner of her eye caught a flicker of movement in the upstairs window. Her eyes snapped upwards, frowning, and just for a bare instant, thought she saw the shape of a huge, shadowy man looming in the window of Nan's study, arms folded across a massive chest, gazing down at her. A shiver scuttled over her skin. Startled, she blinked, and then he was just gone. Okay, whoa. So we blinked quickly twice again, unbelievingly, and then looked again. That can't be right. I was just in that room. Again, that familiar pang of missing something slid through her stomach and prickled up her nape. She stared up for several moments longer, but detected no further movement. Mentally chastising herself, she pulled open the car door. Lord, I must be more exhausted than I thought. Sleep had been a rare commodity for the past few weeks during the time that Nana's health had been failing. Zoe had helped her day and night as Nan had asked her for assistance to ensure that her affairs were in order, and even near the end, when her body had given out, her mind had been just as sharp as it had ever been. Nan had spent laborious hours scratching notes into an ancient, faded journal, on occasion asking Zoe to bring her tea, the odd slice of lightly buttered toast, and tuck yet another warm blanket around her weakening body. Zoe had been more than happy to spend her time with her, but the effort to put on a brave face for Nan, to hide her despondency, had taken a heavy toll on her. Sighing again and putting aside her somber thoughts, she slipped behind the steering wheel, put her key in the ignition, and turned it, steeling herself for the remainder of the hellish day that lay ahead of her. Several days later, Zoe let herself into her apartment, bone-tired. It was late in the evening, and she'd gotten soaked through from the relentless gray drizzle. Grizz, a large, imperious silver-gray tabby, trilled an affectionate greeting as she walked in, jumping down off his perch on the windowsill, and wound his body through her calves, expressing how pleased he was to see her. She smiled at his talkativeness and shrugged off her coat, hanging it on a hook on the wall, dropping her bags on the bench beside the door. She crouched down to stroke the length of his back and tail with both hands and rub him lovingly behind his ears and under his chin, a half-smile brightening her drawn features. High-decibel purring and repeated enthusiastic feline headbutting rewarded her efforts. After one last lingering stroke along his silky striped length, she straightened up and walked with a weary tread into the kitchen, flicking on the light. She inhaled and blew out a breath. What a day! Between the monster stack of old texts waiting to be translated and the tedium of the monthly receivables, she was completely drained. Massaging her temples helped alleviate her headache, but only a little. Fighting the exhaustion that threatened to swamp her, she turned and walked with with purpose over to the buffet table by the wall and selected a bottle of wine she had been saving. Opening it with a small pop, she slowly poured a large glass of the full, spicy Cab Syrah. Allowing it to breathe for a moment, she moved with stoic purpose to the bathroom. Grizz followed close behind, looking up at her with what she'd swear looked like a little furrow of concern between his wide yellow eyes. Both the wine and a bath were a well-deserved reward after the fright today at the reading of Nana's will. She set her wine glass down and turned the faucet on in the tub before turning back to the mirror and studying herself with critical eyes, noting the dark half-moons underneath. Her long dark hair, highlighted with glints of honey and copper, was a damp wavy mess stuck to her head and neck from the rain outside. Her cheekbones were sharp angles in the too bright bathroom light, and her usually golden skin was pale and wan-looking. With a depthness born of long practice, she shied away from the morose shadows lurking behind the whiskey gold of her eyes. Her black, severely cut wool suit was looking rather soggy around the edges, and, in fact, the pale cream silk blouse beneath it would need some serious attention if it was ever going to be wearable again. Well, really, what do I expect, she thought, grimacing at her reflection. With little more than a couple of hours of sleep in a row, or an actual meal in days. Casting a disparaging glance over her figure, she noticed that she'd finally lost a little weight, although, all things considered, it was a hollow victory. Her first welcome sip of wine flowed over her tongue, over her palate, down her throat. Ah, ambrosia. Tipping her head back and closing her eyes, she savored the medley of tastes, the notes, the layers of flavors, the warmth that began to spread like languid fingers caressing her aching muscles. Yes, liquid bliss. Cradling her glass, she lit several thick, fragrant candles near the tub before flipping off the light switch. Carefully, she peeled off her damp clothing and laid each piece with careful precision over the back of the antique carved wooden chair beside the tub. There were always a couple of partially read books stacked on it, and nudging them aside, Zoe placed her glass carefully beside them. Stepping into the warm well of the steaming tub and slowly easing herself into the aromatic bubbles, unable to stop the little groan that escaped from the long overdue luxury. Grizz leapt with ease up onto the vanity edge beside the sink and settled into a comfortable crouch, purring, eyes closing to a contented half-mast, wrapping his tail around his feet. A deep, heart-drawn sigh escaped as she stretched out. Her eyes drifted closed and she reached for her waiting glass of wine. As she savored the wine, her mind kept returning to the puzzle of words she'd been mulling over for the course of several hours. Actually, it had been several phrases from a book that had come in a couple of months ago. She'd worked through most of it without too much difficulty. The last section was something of a departure, though, from the main body of the work. The last chapter had a very different style, with several frustrating phrases that meant little to her. She had strong suspicions it had been originally written or transcribed by a different author, although her reliable source had informed her that it was all of one piece. Still, what she had managed to decipher seemed to be referencing another text, an additional vein of knowledge, an expanded version, as if the 80 or so pages she had translated had been a mere preface to a greater body of work, one of far more importance than the one she'd been struggling with. It felt as if she was playing a frustrating game of hide-and-seek with nuances, because she could not find the right words in her language to express what was written. She was good at her work. She knew this, without any bias or attachment. It was what she was meant to do. So, when this happened to her, and it was rare, when she felt unable to translate the true intent and soul of what the ancient authors had inscribed upon various mediums, she could not leave it alone. Not out of ego, but a genuine need to know. She needed to climb inside, to fit herself into the words, immerse herself inside the phrasing, study them from the inside out, and then re-emerge to become a vessel of the information, the essence channeled into another language for another segment of the population to experience and enjoy, and perhaps in the process also receive the text's gift of illumination. But damn it, this one was different. It was close to confounding her, and what was worse was that there was a vague, haunting familiarity to it. Several years ago, she'd come across similar scribings, and at that time, scholars had scoffed at the alleged origins of the engravings, purported then to be a translated remnant of the lost tongue of angels, and most recently heard of in the 16th century through John Dee and Edward Kelly. She and Nan had had an in-depth discussion then about the subject and about how John Dee had been ridiculed for his beliefs, and Nan had surprised her by supporting the theory that it may actually have had an unearthly origin. Nan even alluded that when she had been a young woman, she had been privileged to translate a piece of a similar language from rubbings of Sumerian or Akkadian cuneiform tablets unearthed in the area thought to be the cradle of civilization on Earth. Disappearing soon after, Right. She'd also mentioned in passing that she'd had help translating it, but had remained mute on her mysterious sources, hinting only that Zoe's grandfather had been involved. The script in question now had a distinct quality that was very reminiscent of that angel's tongue. She remembered the moment of recognition when she realized what she might be holding in her hands. Her stomach had fluttered with excitement when it dawned on her that, even though she hadn't understood all of it as yet, that this was what she'd been looking for, working toward now for years, and suddenly it was almost within her grasp, or rather, the means to find what she'd been searching for so long was possibly within her realm of attainment for the very first time. There had been so many dead ends, false trails, so many lead-ins, so many illusions, from delving into the ancient Hebrew texts and the tablets describing the mystery schools of the ages long gone, Egyptian to ancient Vedic, Sanskrit and Hindi writings, to some of the more newly discovered but equally ancient Gnostic writings, all pointing the way toward her own private mission, a mission that she had committed to many years ago after her parents' tragic demise. It was frustrating. The piece seemed to have a life of its own, flowing and elusive, and oddly, almost had a musical quality. She just couldn't seem to grasp the essence. The right opening into the meaning was only catching glimpses of what might be inside, as if though hidden, narrow, arrow-slit apertures, and even then it was as if the spirit of it flitted from room to room like a mischievous will-o'-the-wisp, teasing her, drawing her in, and then disappearing. The words in the ancient language taunted her. She had stacks and stacks of notes, but nothing really to show for it as far as the actual meaning. Right now, she knew she needed to let it go, or she wouldn't get any rest at all this evening. But it was only by a supreme force of will that she was able to force it back to the back of her mind. As she sipped the wine and allowed the delicious heat of her bath to soak in, she found herself musing again over the fleeting image of the man in the window of her grandmother's house weeks ago. The incident, as brief and odd as it had been, had returned to her thoughts several times since, and the image of the man seemed to get clearer, not fuzzier, in her memory. She knew logically that there could have been no man in her grandmother's house that day, least of all a man that had looked like that. Like some vivid, romantic painting of a warrior of old, powerful, impassive, unvanquishable. Or perhaps some ancient god commemorated by a loving hand in stone by a true master, managing somehow to convey both brilliant light and utmost dark, merging both menacing power and compassionate vulnerability. And the more she dwelt on it, the more she couldn't ignore the nagging sense of familiarity that had been evoked in that tiny glimpse. Although she might admit to having a slight tendency towards an overactive imagination, she knew for a certainty she had never met a man with an appearance like that anywhere, and especially not in this day and age. When the family had gathered there after the memorial service later that same day, she hadn't been able to resist the impulse to creep up to Nana's study to check, just to be sure. And, as she'd suspected, there had been no evidence that there had been anyone other than herself up there. A trick. It must have been some sort of illusion manufactured by her overly fatigued mind. Breathing deeply, she sank deeper into the hot water until the tip of her chin was submerged, soaking in the comforting warmth. She recalled how trying it had been dealing with the family members that had descended upon her, most of them well-meaning, and some perhaps not quite so well-meaning. A wry smile curved her lips as she remembered overhearing a comment yesterday from a visiting aunt informing another relative with some asperity that now that Nana was gone, maybe that poor Zoe can finally find a man to settle down with and start a family and quit messing about with those dusty books and relics. The cousin that her Aunt Willa had been speaking with had agreed, and of course fed her own rather prosaic and irrelevant opinion to the mix. Many of her family were from a traditional bent, solid, honest, hard-working people who admirably knew how to grow a life from little more than the unforgiving land beneath them. Zoe had never lost her own inborn passion for the land and the wildness, along with the beauty and harshness it was capable of, even though she hadn't lived outside of the cities since she had been a small child. The uncompromising fortitude that had sustained her esteemed ancestors, though had at times, likely out of necessity, carved out some of the more fanciful aspects of their natures, or at least had driven them underground, which at times left little room for understanding a person who spent so much of their time immersed in the study of ages long past. Most went well, of course, but at times fell a bit short in the imagination and perhaps the empathy department. They had never let her forget that she was different. Just exactly what that had meant, she wasn't quite sure. Nan had been her only champion then. Those dusty old books and relics, as her Aunt Willa had put it, had been a deep and abiding passion for as long as she could remember. She didn't really expect any of her other family members to understand. Though tolerant, most of them had always looked a little askance, even with a bit of suspicion at Nan and her shop of curiosities. Nan had blithely ignored them all, with a small, knowing smile on her lips. As a child, Zoe had been hungry to absorb all she could, reverently poring over the old and out of print books in her grandmother's store, the antiques, artifacts, books, and collectibles that had come through the shop had captured and ignited her young imagination in a way nothing else had before or since. She had adored the faintly musty smell of the yellowed pages, the mellowed wood, the patina of the tarnished metals, the age-worn stonework. The atmosphere of that wonderful place, with all kinds of secluded nooks and crannies and worn antique chairs tucked away to hide in, sparked her young, fertile imagination. Its soft, diffused lighting, rich, if somewhat faded fabric and upholstery, glowing wood-paneled walls, gleaming marble floors, ancient Turkish rugs, and the large, dark, fiercely carved jade dragon that guarded the large entranceway with its heavy walnut, sparkling cut glass, lead-pane double-glass doors all spoke of a place where magic happened. Nana championed her imagination, helped to nourish it by describing the endless worlds within worlds that most humans had no idea even existed. With countless people being so invested in the surface of their day-to-day lives they believed was reality, they often lived out their entire existence and died without even glimpsing the uncountable realms and possibilities. For Zoe, the most riveting had been the books and artifacts and fantastical concepts dealing with the most ancient civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, Aztec, and even more fanciful tales of Atlantis, Lemuria, and Greek Olympia, along with their heroes and lore from times now long since past, with ancient rituals and artwork sparse in terms of details actually recorded or preserved, therefore permitting Zoe's mind to fly unfettered into fantastic tales that welled up unbidden into her consciousness, fanned also by the fabulous stories Nan had spun for her into the dusky twilight before bedtime, full of magic and honor and heroism. After the dishes had been cleared up and retired to the study in front of the fireplace, or in her bedroom before she drifted off to sleep. Nana had become her entire world after her mother and father had both perished in a horrendous car crash when Zoe was just 6 years old. Zoe had been the only survivor from that single vehicle accident on that tragic night. She was still afflicted by frequent, terrifying dreams that swarmed over her with shrieking metal, shattering glass, consuming fire, and the metallic smell of blood. Of the nightmares, of dark, confusing, snarling, hissing beasts swirling and clashing in the thick blackness, seeking something in the smoke of the wreckage. As her young, terrified mind had screamed for her parents, the strangest image of all came to her. An extremely large, very gentle man carefully lifting her from the back seat of the twisted wreckage of the car, and in the blink of an eye, whisking her away to the safety of a large jumble of boulders alongside the slick pavement, within earshot of the relentless smash of waves on the shore. His good, clean smell, like spice and wind and the forest and ocean waves, was a permanent imprint in her memory. Just as the paramedics had arrived on the nightmarish scene, she vaguely remembered how the huge man had cradled her with profound tenderness to his wide chest, murmuring reassurances of the feeling of being enfolded by large, soft, feathered wings, and a gesture of infinite intimacy, placing a wild tendril of her hair behind her ear and then a reverent, lingering press of his lips on her forehead. She never saw him again. An odd sense of loss still overcame her when she thought of that intimate feeling of complete protection. There were other strange and bizarre memories spawned from that night as well, and ones that chased her still from dreams into waking, confusing wisps of anguished emotions, of heart-rending separations that made no sense at all to her, and didn't even seem connected to anything she'd ever actually experienced. After that early life-altering event, Nan, with vast patience and understanding, had lovingly helped the shattered, hollow-eyed little girl through the terrible process of mourning an event no child can ever fully recover from. It was only years later that Zoe fully realized how deep the wound must have been for Nan to have lost her only child at the same time that Zoe had lost her parents. The traumatic event of Zoe's parents' passing had predictably left a deep, ugly scar. Underneath, it had never truly healed, causing pain to surface still at odd times when she least expected it. Even to her, the wound seemed out of proportion. It seemed to take up more of her psyche than seemed logical, somehow feeling like it went back much further than her years alive would warrant. Although her usual nature consisted of insatiable inquisitiveness about everything, she was very uncharacteristically apprehensive about probing too deeply into this dark and frightening area. From that time on, it had been just her and Nan. To her knowledge, Nan had never had any romantic interests after Zoe's grandfather's tragic and mysterious death had left Nan a young widow, while Zoe's mother was still in diapers, which in adulthood had made Zoe wonder. Her grandmother had always been a passionate, intelligent, and successful woman, and would have doubtless attracted any number of suitors. It had puzzled her why Nan had chosen to remain alone, but it was the one subject on which she'd never felt comfortable questioning her grandmother. And then there was the unpleasant scene today at the lawyer's office. No, Zoe thought with a grimace, I am so not dealing with that now. It can wait. It can all wait, damn it. No, can't. Won't. When the water finally began to cool, Zoe put the glass to her lips and tipped her head back, drowning her last sip of wine. She laid the book aside that had provided her with the distraction she'd needed, pulled her lethargic limbs out of the tub, dried off, and wrapped herself in her thick robe. She twisted her hair up in a towel on the top of her head and snuffed out the candles. Weary, barefoot, she padded slowly into her bedroom and sank down on her bed. Her feline companion shadowed her. Unable now to summon the strength to even hold herself upright, she curled up on her side on the top of her old patchwork quilt, folded at the foot of the bed. She let herself sink into the soft mattress. And then, there, alone, after so many weeks, months, of being so damn strong, she finally allowed herself the long-denied luxury of tears. Unbidden, the tears poured out for the woman who had been like a mother to her, a friend, a confidant, a cheerleader, a mentor, a font of knowledge, a support, a comforter. Tears for the deepest sense of loss she'd ever experienced, greater even than losing her parents all those years ago. Now she was truly alone. She had no one. The onslaught came, huge, gasping, gulping sobs that felt as though they would tear her heart into jagged shards and shatter it irreparably, scatter the fragments to the furthest reaches of the four winds, so that there could be no hope of ever retrieving them, mending them. A wave of deep desolation crashed over her, swamping her, dragged her down to the bottom of that deepest, black, immeasurable chasm of unutterable isolation that had always been there for as long as she could remember, the place that she had always vigilantly avoided, always so carefully skirted around. Her anguish clamped down on her, engulfing her, sobbing devastated, furious, screaming against the injustice, the emptiness, the bleakness of her life without the woman who had cherished her and created a small but precious, beautiful haven, a safe place in the huge, scary world for the two of them. The grief poured out of her, raging wildly over the injustice of losing all she cherished in this life. And then, through the crushing pain, she felt the most peculiar, disparate sense of an odd, slow comfort seep into her. Like some kind of déjà vu feeling, a vague, but yet without a doubt familiar, strong, warm, solid form to lean into of a large, soothing hand, a protector to curl up against and rest. Where would that have come from? Not the feel of Nan, but yet the strongest sense of someone else, comfortable and trusted without question. The pain gradually eased and made her feel just slightly less like she was completely deserted. She was confused by the sensation, but also acutely aware she lacked the required impetus to chase that question down to its conclusion right now. And then, even more bewildering, through the pain in her chest and the racking sobs, she had the most perplexing feeling. She could have sworn that a pair of warm, very masculine lips had feathered fleetingly across her brow in a light, comforting gesture. The slightest wafting hint of an oddly familiar scent her mind was unable to pin down. So we finally spent her tears, feeling like weeks had elapsed, and far older now than her years. Exhausted and depleted, she uncurled slowly and forced herself to get up off the bed to get a glass of water, hoping to quell the small shuddering sobs that were not quite ready to release her from their grasp. Tightening the belt on her robe, she shook out her still damp hair and hung up the towel on a hook for it to dry, her fingers ruffling through the unruly strands. On her way to the kitchen, her swollen, grief-reddened eyes scanned the half-packed boxes in her living room that she had been filling for the past few evenings, sorting and gathering up her belongings for her move back into Nan's house. A fresh wave of bleak despair threatened to overwhelm her. Without much thought, she detoured and lifted the lid off of the white cardboard file folder box sitting on her coffee table. It was the box that the lawyer had handed her earlier today, just before her hasty departure from his office. It contained Nan's more personal effects, he'd said, that she had locked in a safety deposit box until her passing. The contents, as well as the letter, were included, as per her directive, the lawyer had explained. So he hadn't had the time to open it then, so she'd just taken it and dropped it off at home on her way to meet a client. Now she looked and saw a huge, fat, brown paper envelope sitting on top of the other contents with a label spelling out Zoe St. Clair. She unwound the red string closure and lifted the flap to peer inside. It contained a thick, leather-bound journal. If she wasn't mistaken, the very one Nan had been writing in with painstaking concentration during the last months, as her strength ebbed away. Zoe pulled out the journal and moved to open it, but was distracted by what had created a rather largish lump in the bottom of the envelope. She reached in and pulled out a worn black velvet drawstring bag. Whatever was in there was surprisingly heavy for its size. She pulled the strings apart and reached inside, feeling cool metal. The small metal box nestled inside was about 3 by 2.5 inches, with worn glyphs etched into the tarnished, pale metal. Her eyes widened, and she looked at it more closely, for once uncertain of the origin of either the writing or the metal. It was certainly ancient, and unlike any artifact or relic she'd ever come across. There was a tiny, intricately worked clasp on the front and ornate filigreed hinges on the reverse side. The seam that divided the top and the bottom half was nearly impossible to detect. The little box appeared to be giving off an odd, very slight, distinct glow, and as she held it, it seemed that she felt and heard a faint, almost indiscernible, multi-layered hum, a whispering, as if it were vibrating faintly just on the very edge of registrable sound. She blinked several times, not trusting her eyes. Curiosity piqued, she turned it over slowly several times in her hands, exploring it with her fingertips, and then with breathless caution attempted to open the tiny catch. It thwarted her attempts, however, and unwilling to inadvertently damage the obviously priceless piece, she replaced the tiny box in its drawstring pouch and then dropped it into her robe pocket. She picked up the heavy old journal, stood up, and continued on into the kitchen to get her glass of water, intending to sit down and study them both in more detail at the table. Zoe walked to the table and laid the journal down, preoccupied about what the tiny box might contain. She went over to the cupboard, opened the door, and reached for a glass. Without warning, her equilibrium was ripped from her, and she nearly toppled headlong. Her hand, outstretched to grasp the glass, shot out instead to grasp the edge of the countertop in a desperate bid to regain her balance. The room felt as though it was violently tilting, whirling. At the same time came a powerful shifting, sliding, a brutal rending, as if two worlds were trying to force themselves at the same time into a space too small for either of them, vying to oust the other, vicious, snarling, both out for blood. Somewhere in the background she heard very faint but distinct unearthly strains of strange chimes, hundreds, maybe thousands of all types and tones, all ringing, singing at the same time, filling her ears, her head, stretching, thinning out her consciousness to an unbearable capacity, and still increasing to an impossible level. Accompanying the unworldly symphony was a massive, dull roaring that made Zoe feel as if she were caught in the center of a hurricane, the force threatening to tear her limbs from her body, separate her blood cells from plasma, atoms from their nuclei. A sickening sense of accelerating vertigo clamped itself around her gut, tossed her down to the floor, retching and fighting for control over basic bodily functions. Even as its grip on her eased by a few degrees, she felt like she'd been sucked into a tornado of wet sand, filling up her lungs, smothering her, pulling her down into the center of its inexorable, crushing vortex. The lights in her kitchen dimmed and flickered, then flared to blinding, and then returned to normal once more. Somewhere in the apartment, she heard the distinct pop of a light bulb exploding. The powerful sense of furious shifting and heaving abated as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Zoe with the deceptive feeling of falling backwards at the sudden inertia. Breath choking on frantic gasps, hauling in oxygen through her mouth and nose, body soaked in perspiration, her heart careened in a crazy gallop in her chest, and sparks of light flickered in a mad show behind her eyelids. It was only that one single sound, that of the light bulb breaking, that reassured her that she was not having a brain aneurysm, that something had indeed torn a hole through the fabric of her reality, and not through her gray matter. Zoe focused hard, grasping at that one small detail, straining to pull herself back into some semblance of normalcy. With laborious effort, she pushed herself up into a sitting position on the floor, grateful for the feeling of the cold tiles. Slumped against the cupboard doors, chest heaving, her wild eyes darted around the room. What in the name of all that is holy was that? She shook her head, blinking rapidly, trying to make some kind of sense of it, desperate to come up with some kind of logical explanation. None came to mind. She noticed Grizz then, crouching sideways in the doorway of the kitchen, growling low in his throat, ears flat, arched on the tips of his toes, claws unsheathed, his glowing green dilated pupils darting everywhere, silver hair puffed out. He'd sensed it too. The ridiculous relief she felt brought tears to her eyes. With a shaking hand, she shoved her damp hair back from her wet forehead, drawing in a long, unsteady breath. Managing to gain her feet, a sickening wave of nausea seized her again, saliva pooling in her mouth, cold beads of perspiration popping out again on her forehead and the back of her neck. Zoe pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, closing her eyes. The exhaustion brought on by the past several days had taken its toll. She wanted nothing more than to crawl into her bed, pull the covers over her head, and stay there for a week or 3. She managed to pour her glass of water with shaking hands, and then, with one last look at the journal on the table, retreated to her bedroom. She shrugged her robe off onto the foot of her bed, and with Herculean effort, found and donned her softest pajamas, then burrowed under her favorite puffy, crinkly duvet. With a small groan, she wiggled, trying to get comfortable. So he attempted to empty her mind, grateful at that moment that the weekend began tomorrow. Her belly clenched momentarily, terrified that what had transpired that evening might trigger another of her nightmares. Grizz leapt from the floor and crept from the foot of the bed to snuggle into the curve of her belly, purring loudly. Blessedly, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the exhausting events of the evening, she slipped easily into a deep sleep. That exact same sense of warm calmness that had comforted her while she had wept earlier flowed over her again, soothing her into vague, disconnected, and unexpected dreams of tenderness and light. So I'll leave you with that for now, and then in the next few days maybe continue on if that's something that would be helpful. Thank you again for listening. I really appreciate it. Take care. Good night.